in the mid '80s, Iowa City was a little too slow for me. I wanted to go someplace where there were bigger things happening. A little small, it's kind of it's a small town.
Yeah.
And that was the Reagan era, and it was, there was just so many terrible things happening under Reagan, so many setbacks. Reagan was, literally turning back the hands of time on a lot of fronts, and I was trying to figure out, where to go after Iowa City, and then Harold Washington was elected in Chicago, the first black mayor, and a real progressive, a real great man, and the movement that brought him to power was just so exciting. I had a number of student movement friends that were in Chicago and were part of that movement, and they were sending us newsletters, and I was having late night phone conference calls, and I had been to some conferences in Chicago, in '82 and '83 when Washington was running and came into office, and I got the feel for how exciting it was. People have to remember how terrible the Democratic Party has been in the history of our country. Old Man Daley, that ran that city for 20-some years, the Chicago police, which are, again, have made headlines in recent years, the Laquan McDonald case being the most horrific murder that they've committed. But it's not just the police, it's the city political structure above them. So, for example, in 1968, when Martin Luther King was killed, essentially every city in America had a rebellion, riots they called them, and there were rioters that were killed in many cities, but in only one city did the mayor issue a shoot to kill order. That was Chicago. And a year later, in December of 1969, the Chicago Police Department, together with the FBI, assassinated the two leaders of the Black Panther Party. They drugged them and then approached their building, their house, at 3 in the morning, and 9 Chicago cops opened up with every kind of weapon imaginable, shotguns, rifles, machine guns, shot hundreds of shots through the door of the house. The Panthers were drugged, they were asleep, and Fred Hampton and Mark Clark died that night. None of those cops or FBI agents was ever even charged, let alone went to prison for that. So by the 1980s, black people in Chicago were 40% of the population. Chicago also has a very corrupt political system, always has, still does. 3 million people in the city, 50 members of the city council. New York City has less than 20 members of their city council, and it's 3 times as big. Every one of these politicians gets paid today like $150,000. It's just an enormously corrupt system. But in 1980, 40% of the city was black. You would think that 40% of the city council would be black. 20 people out of 50. There were 9. Those white racist Democrats under Old Man Daley had systematically redrawn the maps decade after decade to keep black people from having equal representation. So this movement emerged at the tail end of the 70s for equality, for equity in the city, and it resulted in the election of Harold Washington, and it was a real reform movement, not just electing a black person that's palatable to the powers that be. The powers that be opposed Harold Washington, and it took just enormous community organizing to defeat the white racist Democrats. And it was so exciting to me that I said, that's where I'm going. So I moved to Chicago, and I worked on Harold's re-election campaign and many other city council races and state representative races for for blacks, for Chicanos, for Puerto Rican candidates for office. A year and a half after I got there, Harold Washington died of a heart attack, and the movement fell apart. But I had been bitten by the Chicago bug. I just loved being in the middle of this city. It just seemed to be like a living organism. It just beat like a heart. And I knew I was never going to leave, and I'm never going to leave. I love Chicago.
Wow.
So anyway, then that movement fell apart. Then my ex-wife and I, we got married. We had children, and you know how it is. 20 years can fly by once the kids are born, because it just having kids is a universe unto itself. But I always stayed politically involved, and I got a job where there was a union at the employer, but it wasn't a good union, and then we discovered all sorts of corrupt things. I worked for the state, and we discovered all sorts of corrupt things at the state level too. So for 10 years or more, the main thing I did was I was an activist in my union. One of the issues we had to deal with there was racism also. When the University of Illinois built the campus in Chicago, that's where I work, UIC, they hired about 1,000 support staff. This is 1965. They hired about 1,000 black people. Basically, it was almost all black, the workforce there. They had a campus in Urbana, of course, Illinois. But when they hired the 1,000 black people, almost all black people in Chicago, they hired them at $1 an hour or $2 an hour less than the workforce in Urbana. Now everyone knows the cost of living in Chicago is 30% or more higher than the small towns. How could they justify doing that? When I started working there, one of the first things I heard from a black coworker, he said, we make less money than Urbana. So I got involved in the union. I eventually got on the bargaining committee, and after a couple of rounds of contract negotiations, we built up enough of a head of steam that we compelled management to tell us how this system of unequal pay came about. They told us it was the market, and we said back to them, that makes no sense. Everything is more expensive in Chicago. How could you justify them? How could the market justify paying the workers in Chicago less than the workers in Urbana? Well, they came right back to us. The labor market. There were more people willing to work for less in Chicago than Urbana in 1965. Well, think about that. Why? Why were there more people in Chicago willing to work for less in 1965? And who were they, those people willing to work for less? They weren't the white population. They were the black population. Well, why were they willing to work for less? Because in the era following the Second World War, Southern agriculture had mechanized, and those racist plantation owners who had employed black sharecroppers who were second-class citizens, not allowed the right to vote, and in the 50s and 60s, they threw them out of work. So the wave of migration that happened from the Second World War up through the 60s brought 150,000 black people to Chicago, and they arrived penniless.
Yeah, so they were willing to...
They were willing to work for less. So the university took advantage. It was the shadow of the plantation. And this ivory tower took advantage of these poor black people. And when I came to work there 30 years later, the pay disparity was still in place. So we built a an enormous coalition and a mass mobilization, and it took us almost a decade to win pay equity with Urbana, and we won it. And so I became a leader in my union. I had always maintained some involvement with the students on campus and with the anti-war movement in the city, but I wasn't really that involved. My ex-wife, she got very involved doing Palestine solidarity work in the course of the, late 90s, up through 2010. She never actually traveled there, but she was, doing educational projects and what is now called BDS, boycott, divestment, sanction campaigns. And in the summer of 2008, I helped to coordinate. I coordinated buses going from Chicago to St. Paul, Minnesota, for the protest at the Republican National Convention, where McCain and Palin were nominated.
Okay.
And 2 years later, it was a very strange morning. In 2010, the FBI showed up at our front door with a warrant to search our home and a subpoena to appear in front of a federal grand jury and it alleged that we had been part of a conspiracy to provide material support to foreign terrorist organizations in Palestine and Colombia. And we were pretty freaked out, to say the least.
Yeah.
There were 16 FBI agents that entered our home at 7 in the morning. At lunchtime, some of them knocked off. I guess they had had an earlier shift. They sent 8 more. And they didn't leave until almost 7 o'clock at night. So in the course of that 12-hour day, there were 25 men and women in our home searching through every part of our lives. They seized our computers, our cell phones, our passports. They not only searched our files, they searched our children's rooms. And at the end of the day, they hauled away 30 boxes of our papers, our personal papers, our notebooks, our files, some of our books.
What year was that?
September 24th, 2010. And we discovered during the course of the morning, they allowed us to keep a cell phone to call a lawyer. And we found out that the FBI had raided us and simultaneously raided 6 other homes in 3 states, in Chicago, in Grand Rapids, Michigan, and in Minneapolis. We later found out they also visited homes of activists in Milwaukee, Asheville, North Carolina, Tucson, Arizona, and San Jose, California. And when we looked at the list of everyone that had been visited, the only thing that everyone had in common was that protest at the Republican National Convention in 2008. And then the people from Minneapolis who were raided, we had a meeting a week later of all the people who'd been subpoenaed to the federal grand jury, where there's a law office in Chicago that it's kind of like the Center for Constitutional Rights in the Midwest. It's called the People's Law Office. They had defended the Black Panthers back in the late 60s and early 70s.
Nice.
And they explained to us, how the federal grand jury worked. Anyway, but the thing that the Minnesota people realized is that a woman who got involved with the anti-war coalition in Minnesota for that protest in 2008 and who had stayed around and become very active over the next 2 years, had disappeared 1 week before the raids. And they came to the conclusion that she was some kind of police agent that had infiltrated the movement. And we later got confirmation that she was, in fact, the agent that had infiltrated us.
Yeah, we were at a. I was. You want some? Oh, you want some? Oh, you got plenty of coffee.
I got plenty.
We were. It was the thing at Drake that I got some notoriety, and it was an anti-war meeting of some sort, and there was a. I've come to find out a little bit later there was a FBI agent, a couple of people that were at this, open to the public event. But wow. So that didn't. That whole experience, which is ongoing.
Yep, that has that case. A case involving terrorism has an 8-year statute of limitations.
No.
So we're not out of the woods yet. And Steve Bannon, who's now one of the top advisors to the incoming president, Breitbart News, under his direction, he was the publisher of it over the last 8 years, or the last 6 years rather. They have talked about our case. They don't refer to us as alleged terrorists. They refer to us as terrorists. So that man believes that I'm guilty, and all of us are guilty, and he has the ear of the president. And there were 70 agents, FBI, Homeland Security, ICE, Bureau of Indian Affairs. There were 70 agents in the field the day they raided us. 70 in 7 different U.S. attorney districts. And that grand jury had been impaneled for a year when they raided us. And their attorneys told our attorneys that they had enough to indict us already. And when we traveled to Washington to talk to congressmen about our case, we were told by multiple congressmen that the FBI had told them that we were not this was not a free speech case, that we were criminals, and that we knew what we had done, and that we were going to prison. And yet they've never even charged us.
That says a lot right there, don't you think?
Well, I believe that they thought that ours was going to be an easy case to win, because generally in a federal court, you raise the word terrorism and somebody's going to prison. But I think that they didn't count on 2 things. Number one, the people that they raided, us, were not terrorists. We're not just, social justice activists, political activists, but most of the people they raided had been lifelong activists, people that were, well-respected, good organizers. So we believe that the Department of Justice, the U.S. Attorney, thought they put us on the front page of the paper, and we were on the front page of all the local papers, top story on all the local TV stations. We were in the New York Times the morning after we were raided. They believed that they label us as terrorists. I think they thought that all of our liberal friends and peace-loving friends would leap away from us like we were a hot stove. But instead what happened is, first, the peace movement rallied around us. Then most of the labor movement rallied around us, at least in the Midwest, where most of us were. We got unions representing over 1 million members to adopt resolutions in our defense at conventions. Not just presidents of unions, union members. And eventually we went and got 14 members of Congress to write letters of concern to Attorney General Eric Holder, saying essentially, this looks like a civil liberties case to us. And so that's one reason why we think they've never brought charges. And I think the second reason is that we learned, all of us, pretty quickly, that a grand jury is a body that is that violates the Constitution. It's unconstitutional in its character, but it's so powerful. It's a prosecutorial tool that there was an expression that a grand jury will indict a ham sandwich. Grand juries, federal grand juries, return over 99% indictments in the cases in front of them. In a grand jury, number one, there is no judge. It's just the prosecutor. Number two, you don't have the right to have your lawyer present. Number three, you don't have the right to see the evidence against you. Number four, you don't have the right to question any witnesses against you. So, you know what happens when there's a new Attorney General at the head of the Department of Justice? The Attorney General, one of the first things in office, that person has to say to his staff, bring me a list of all the major cases that are not closed. So my case is a major case. There were 70 agents in the field. There were 6 different U.S. attorneys that were involved in it. They spent millions of dollars investigating us, and they believed they had a slam dunk. And so I believe between that, the fact that there's a new Attorney General and that Steve Bannon's in the White House, I think the chances are pretty darn good that they're going to take another look at us.
Rear its ugly head.
So that's why we have to be talking about our case. So Roger, I really appreciate the fact the opportunity to talk about it.